much like the global state of the world. It's gonna be what it's gonna be.
It's gonna be what it is. I just wait for the history to unfold, I guess.
As long as I can continue to get my cans of cold baked beans, for as long as inflation doesn't mess with that too much, I'll be fine.
What kind of beans are in? Anyway, that doesn't really matter.
The same. It's all the same bullshit. It's just the same Heinz, but fucking high fructose corn syrup bullshit. With some beans mixed in. I don't know. And some slop. I don't know. I was like frantically trying to like finish this reading, make notes, and make dinner at the same time. And I was I think we're both kind of in the same boat. So
I don't know whether I did any of those things, actually. Several of them I didn't even attempt.
Well, we did, for the listener, we did just realize about, I don't know, 20 minutes before we came on the call that I had sent, I don't know how I did this. I sent you something different than what I read, kind of, where you read the online version of this stuff and I read the print version, which is a PDF online of this stuff, and the print version with the PDF online that doesn't have some of the things. So potentially you've read more than me, and you're more clued into the global. You're shaking your head. You're more clued into the global state of the world.
Hey, we'll see.
How about before we get stuck into it? Well, I'll just say really quick. We read some stuff from kind of a relatively new publication called Heatwave, which is kind of like a in our general kind of like ecosphere of the kind of like ultra lefty stuff, grappling with some kind of social democracy questions and ecological questions, stuff that's generally in our wheelhouse, I guess is the best way to put it. And we read a collection of essays that they published by a bunch of different authors called the Tariff Dossier. And this was written kind of like a little while ago now, to kind of at the beginning of Trump's second term, to kind of talk about Liberation Day and all of the tariffs and what does it mean, and what's a Marxist analysis and all of this stuff. But before we get into it, how are you feeling about the state of things? Are you feeling like this is kind of like a crazy and insane time that we're living through? Or are you kind of like, hey dude, whatever, man? How are you feeling?
I have a disposition. I guess I have a very fatalist disposition, I suppose. but my fatalism usually takes the form of optimism, in the sense that, like, I don't have to do anything, and hopefully it'll turn out all right.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to happen, right? Like, we've got to get socialism.
I don't feel like hugely optimistic, like we're on the road to socialism, I guess. You'd be hard pressed to feel that way, I think.
I would be impressed.
Given it being of any politics or in any particularly stated, I don't know. Yeah, unless you're like a hardcore Mamdaniite, I suppose. But
yeah, I was going to say, unless you're like on the payroll of some sort of like large quote unquote large social democracy movement at the moment, or you're like in that media sphere, then you're probably
If you draw your paycheck from it, which fair play, whatever. And there's the prospect of you being able to continue to do that. All power to you, I suppose, unless you're doing anything actively. Like,
I mean, we're funded by the CIA, so we're a little bit different. And am I whatever? Am I 6 or whatever? So we don't have to worry about that.
Imagine that.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like in recent months, it's become less of a question of. I've found myself thinking, and this I think is more about my own mental state. I find myself thinking less about global politics in terms of the potential for socialism. That's still obviously definitely there, but I've found myself thinking a lot more about like, oh, wow, how bad is this going to get? Where is this going now? And I don't think I'm like the only person thinking like that. I think a lot of recent events have been pretty scary, obviously, to say nothing of just like, just being horrific, right? Like, but yeah.
I mean, my disposition is usually to ask myself the question, do I understand this, or do I think it's possible for me to understand what's happening? And if I think that I understand what's happening, then I suppose to a degree that I've rationalized it. And if I've rationalized it, then I can kind of accept it. Maybe that's just my effort. And as long as it doesn't just seem like mad, and as long as they don't slip into total disbelief of what's happening.
Yeah.
I
You know what?
at least like feel comfortable in the world,
Yeah.
or like not gonna anyway.
Yeah, I think interesting. We'll get into one of these pieces. I feel like kind of the one that was written by Schwang. Did you read that one? Yeah. That one I feel like took a really interesting approach to this, where it was kind of both at the same time, where it was like, yeah, it's really bad, but also like, this isn't some epochal change in the mode of production and slipping into like, mega ultra fascism, which, like, depending on how you define that, maybe that happened 50 years ago, you know what I mean? Depending on how you define it. But it was really interesting the way, at least, that kind of like ultra left attitude was kind of like, I don't know. It was almost kind of refreshing. It's like, listen, you can't be an ultra leftist and say that social democracy is going to fail for XX and X reasons, but then be like, oh, but fascism is going to succeed in its political and economic goals. You know what I mean? It's like, for all the same reasons about, falling rate of profit and the organic composition of capital and all of that stuff. But like, I did kind of like that approach of just like, well, it's going to fail. So like, it's going to be bad, but like,
yeah. One of these pieces seemed to end with sort of the conclusion that the only way to look at the sort of the broad swath of Trumping policies is the kind of like a political effort of a group of people to bring something into being, and we should look at it as if that's possible, then there's no reason why our political project, however we define it, isn't also like an option.
Yeah. I mean, I remember somebody I know when Trump first got elected was like, there's a positive way of thinking about this where it's like, if he can get elected president, anybody can get elected president. You know what I mean? It's like, until you actually think about it, and you're like, okay, wait, the son of a billionaire.
Son of a billionaire, media personality, saying things that at least appeal to some subsection of capital and having lots of like,
no morals.
Anyway, that's not. That's not. I mean,
Okay,
I suppose to take the thrust of your initial question and put it in the context of these pieces. I think I would say that this group of reading hasn't made me feel.
Yeah. We keep saying that.
Yeah.
Everything we've read recently. It's like,
You remember we were going to like go and read some nice social democracy, but
I think I might be in dire need of that for like next time, where it's like you just build the mass party, and I'll be like, yes, just build the mass party.
But it's in some respects, this is. I mean, you suggested these, and maybe you would. I mean, obviously, there are allowed to be multiple reasons for that. Some of them relate to just the general way in which we pick up reading for these episodes.
Yes, the material reasons for the way
yes. But this is a nice,
which I will say quickly amounts to us promising to read Workers' Councils, me not being able to get a hold of it in time, and then realizing that it's much longer than I thought. So, material reasons aside.
Yes, Turns out Amazon doesn't know how long Anton Pannecook's book Workers' Council is.
I got mine off of eBay.
Given that that's the case, there really is no hope for the sort of fully automated communist future.
That's literally what I was thinking. Yeah, exactly. I got mine. I bought mine off of eBay, and it was like used. But then it was like, this is going to take like almost a month to get to, even though it's just coming from England. And I was like, does that just mean that this is like pull production that now is like slower than when it was just like, just like a used book? Trying to find that, whatever. It'll probably come with saying like Amazon on it or some shit, whatever.
But this is a nice follow-up to last week's reading. And in some ways, maybe this is the communist version of the sort of like slightly liberal reading that we made last week. Because a lot of this overlaps the question of like global development, and I can't even remember whether it's that reading or the one before that by
on the migrant one.
But yeah, maybe, I don't know. Anyway,
I think it was both. I think a lot of the same questions come up.
Yeah.
I think one of these essays made me feel like it was. I think you're right. A lot of these taken together, it was like the long slow death of global development, but not liberal, like a Marxist reading. Whereas one of them in particular, I forget which one it was, I think it was the one on Mexico, was like the migrant reading, but theory communist.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's try and find a way to talk about all of these pieces together. They're all available for free, so just go read them because they're all really, really worth reading. And yes, I guess maybe we can just start kind of with the editorial, which is the kind of Heatwave people talking about why they wanted to publish all these different things, why they wanted to focus on the tariffs particularly, and kind of to use that as a tool to try and understand Trump too. And whenever I see it called Trump too, it's like, oh, I don't know. I'm just reminded that this guy was just a media guy, and it just makes me feel sick. Yes, I mean, I guess maybe we should say at the beginning, give ourselves a refresher because of how quickly things move now about like what the tariffs were, or I mean, continue to be, but what they were on like Liberation Day or whatever. Yeah, which, like, oh my God, what consultant came up with that shit?
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I think this a little caveat is just for me to say is that kind of these events kind of passed me by when they were actually happening. Like I was vaguely aware, but like this is almost the first time I've systematically engaged with the idea of tariffs, and I haven't. I have some idea, particularly in relation to threatened tariffs against China. I have some idea of how that has evolved over the past 9 months or so, but yeah, this was sort of my first systematic engagement with this whole thing. So it's a bit strange to be doing it sort of like it's recent past, but you know. So I'm keen to. Yeah. I think this is important to like have a little top up, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember watching Trump's Liberation Day. It is called Liberation Day, right? I'm not just.
That's what they're calling it. You've not invented that.
It's not the alien movie where they blow up the White House. That's Independence Day.
That's Independence Day. Yeah, Independence Day. Nor is it anyway. Yeah.
Nor is it, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, no, it's not a sequel. To...
I remember watching that speech that Trump gave, where he had the little chart live, and the thing that I remember taking from it was not so much why was this the beginning of like a new era for American economic and imperial policy, but it was more so just like how quickly Trump went from the like scripted, stern, authoritarian, like, and on this country, we're going to do 15. And as you'll see, they give us 20% tariffs on our goods. So it's actually really quite a good deal, to how quickly he just went off script and was just like casino owner, Atlantic City Trump. It's just like, yeah, oh my God. His personality, like, I know this isn't a hot take, but like it needs to be studied. He is such a strange person. Anyway, the tariffs, like how it originally began was that there was this quick introduction of a 10% flat tariff on all US imports. So everything coming from everywhere, right? And then on top of that, there was this idea of reciprocal tariffs on what is considered by the administration, unfair trade deals, right? And it's this idea that they were pointing to where they were like, well, actually, these countries of that are a fraction of the size are, putting taxes on our exports to their country, well in excess of what we're doing. So really, we're being nice people by doing this, blah, 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 blah. But I do think that the editorial was right to kind of like single out both of these things as part of the same kind of like attack on international trade, so-called like free trade and stuff, but then also kind of like show that there's a difference, right? There's like difference between the tariff on everything, which is just like protect America first or whatever. And then there's like the real, I hesitate to say anything coming out of the Trump administration is nuanced for a million reasons, but like there's the nuanced kind of like, okay, well, what are we trying to get from Venezuela? That's going to be quite a bit different than what we're trying to get from like, I don't know, France or something like that. And those reciprocal tariffs, really reflected how this administration and also the previous administrations view currently their relationships with different countries. And if you look at that little chart that Trump made, it's pretty clear. It's amounts to, to be as abstract as possible, like an extraction of wealth from poorer countries. With the threat of like pulling away American security, or even not even just for poorer countries, right? Like the threat of pulling American security away from like anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is one of these pieces that I can't remember which, but a sort of general thrust in these is to argue that these are not purely economic, which is obviously right. They're not a purely economic tool. They're actually a function of like I guess, US imperialism, like the US attempting to exercise some power and control over countries in the world. And I guess in some ways that's sort of interesting in the context of, interesting to place that alongside their sort of like foreign policy, like aspirations, who they're threatening, like this, to place a sort of economic strategy which is inherently political, alongside a sort of like military, sort of international relations strategy as well. It's sort of the two pair together, interestingly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to say on that, like, it is pretty funny how just like openly this mirrors something like, the mafia in New York City or some shit, just like going to like a delicatessen and being like, you don't pay your protection money, we're gonna, I don't know, kidnap the bodega cat, or however New York works. I haven't really been to New York, so I don't actually know. But like it is just strong arming different countries into, accepting new trade deals. And there's a really good point made here where they're like, it can be kind of difficult to give a Marxist analysis of specific policies sometimes, because Marxist analysis, at least to me, like really shines when it's looking at abstracts and it's looking at like abstractions, I guess I should say, and looking at like tendencies, obviously, because Marxian economic laws and all that, and even like, political understanding, like those laws really tend to assert themselves in aggregate. That's kind of like, it's not really the best way of understanding individual specific one person's motives, right? But there's a really interesting point made in here where it's like, sometimes when you're trying to figure out like global international trade and international politics, and if you only have a few levers at your command, the best way to do it is to just use blunt force and just like, hey, what do we want? Well, we want a million different things from a million different countries, but the best way to go about, securing all of those myriad different things is to just use real knuckle dragging, heavy-handed things to just go, well, now you are forced into kind of like renegotiating trade deals away from, the kind of like, I don't know, multilateral agreements that had been formed before that, or kind of like the, good old like globalized liberal order where things are done a certain way. Now you're forced into just doing what this administration wants, and it's like, instead of trying to be nuanced about it, fuck it, just slap tariffs on everything,
Mm-hmm. And in some ways the sort of the Trumpian style of the bluster and the confusion and the sort of threatening things and then pulling them away, and like does a good job of like masking but also complementing that kind of like strategy of applying tariffs in different ways to different people in different scenarios. One of the interesting things that was kind of like evoked in that introductory piece by Heatwave, and then sort of like came up in a lot of these pieces in various ways, and I think these pieces took different strategies to this to some extent, or at least the way that I ended up trying to add a meta narrative to all of this, or a sort of initial question was that like, how do we characterize the regime of tariffs? Are they representative purely of ideology, political will, a certain type of nationalism asserting itself in the United States, and sort of at the most like base level, I suppose, how much do we just associate them with Trumpian madness and bluster and like erraticness, and like it's possible, and somebody might want to like pin it all on his style, his desire to negotiate, and like all of that coming from a very personal ideological position, I suppose. And then the other end of the spectrum is to try and see a kind of like ultimate genius in all of it, or is there a kind of like a secret strategy at hand? And then
a mercurial intelligence.
Yes, I'm intelligent, but just in a way you don't understand. I might try and, might find an opportunity to use the phrase mercurial intelligence. I can't remember which of the pieces used it.
Yeah, I forget. It's very funny though.
But for me also, it kind of got me thinking a little bit about the question of like neoliberalism, which I haven't talked about in the past, but there is a little bit of a debate about whether neoliberalism can be recognized as a purely political strategy. Like they were faced with a multitude of economic opportunities or options. The ruling class chose neoliberalism as a way to destroy the regime that existed beforehand and therefore impoverish workers and like destroy the welfare state and blah 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 blah. Or was it a necessary reaction to the sort of cyclical crisis-ridden nature of capitalism? Like, was it that economic growth was falling, rates of profit were stagnating and falling, and they need to find a new way to revivify the sort of global economy? And I found myself thinking about this in a similar way, and it's possible, I think, to like slip into thinking that there is an effort being made at a systemic realignment similar to what we now sort of like colloquially think of as like neoliberalism, I suppose. There is a similar realignment happening, or like there is a theoretical there is a theory behind some of the strategy that's seeming to be implemented. It's potential. Reading some of these pieces, perhaps I initially came away with the idea that some of them were trying to paint a picture or raising the question of like, is this the necessary only alternative for the system? Should we see this sort of tariff regime as an effort to change the global economic order in a way which is necessary and a sort of like a reaction to the same kind of like systemic breakdown of capitalism, declining profit rates, blah 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 blah. I don't know. That isn't to say that like neoliberalism didn't also have a political element, which was to repress workers, and the elements of these essays which highlight the way in which this tariff regime also represents an effort to discipline the global proletariat and further impoverish it. It's definitely
absolutely.
an important element. But
Absolutely. And I mean, it gets you into questions. I think that's a really excellent point. And I mean, it gets you into questions too about like, well, what is it? What options are available to a system of this magnitude and complexity? Oh, which we should say, other than socialism.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Other than that, other than abolishing class society, like for capitalist society to continue, like, plenty of times it comes up in these pieces that it's like Biden tried to do something slightly different. A lot of the time he was just kind of keeping a lot of Trump's old policies, specifically around immigration and, trade regime stuff. But there was a real effort. I don't just want to be like, ruling class people are the same kind of guy. But like there was a real effort on that administration's part to continue a type of like neoliberalism of a type. Biden and many of his supporters thought of him as like a new FDR. So maybe they didn't think of it as neoliberalism, I guess, in kind of a crazy way. But it really opens up some interesting questions about like, how much room for autonomy is there in systems of this magnitude? And when maybe we can get to talking about the Schwang piece here in a little bit, but like they really make a good point where it's like even Trump's options are limited, because like he'll try to do all of these crazy things, and then the markets and the trade routes that have been established over the course of decades and decades and decades, like, will just snap back to where they were because they need to, because it's in the ruling classes of many different countries, including China and the United States, to limit the scope of action, which is the main contradiction at the moment, right? Because it's like, well, clearly something needs to happen to kind of like revivify profit rates or whatever. But I think really quickly, while we're on this editorial, I'm just going to read one bit that I thought was kind of one of the best bits of all of these, where they just, to kind of as a way of trying to understand Trumpism and stuff. And I think to get into kind of what you're talking about like trying not to get lost in the weeds of a very clearly chaotic administration and just like the most absurd personalities on the planet. They say, for any administration, the actual rollout of policies express conflicting interests of actual capital and capitalists, imperial and sub-imperial alike. If they appear especially incoherent today, it is only because Trump and his kind represent just such a discordant harmony of cross-class and inter-class alliances presented as popular hegemony. The apparent paradox disappears if we reject the assumption that there's a singular base at all. Today's hegemony is the expression of real disunity and fragmentation. For some reason, like that's an idea that I've come across before, but it really only clicked for me, I think, when I was reading that, where it's like, oh yeah, the way politics works isn't this idealized Marxist version that we all like to have in our heads, where it's like, and now the productive fascist capitalists are in control with Trump. And before this, it was the like once upon a time happy multicultural neoliberal tech people who were just trying to technocracy their way. It's like, this isn't the way politics works. And I actually think like this was a really astute way of putting it there. But I also think like Marxist social democrats tend to kind of, I think, understand this as well, mainly because this is their main area of struggle, right? Where it's like, there's your base and then there's your base, right? There's your base, wink, wink, and then there's your actual base, where it's like, they're the people you represent in any modern political party, but then there's also the people that vote for you. And so you're inevitably going to have a contradiction there. But then you're also going to have a contradiction in your real base, meaning like the capitalists that you represent, like, because they're going to want different things, you know? So it's like, if Trump's administration seems chaotic and it seems like it doesn't make any sense and seems contradictory, I guess I should say, well, there's a reason for that. It's because it's contradictory and it doesn't make any sense because it's made up of a bunch of alliances that don't make any sense and are contradictory, right? Like, yeah, it's worth remembering that, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you highlight that, because I didn't really pick it up in that reading. But like, yeah, it's interesting that like there is a material basis to the chaos, the disharmony, or something that you might imagine to be purely an ideological fight or something is actually like representative of material conflicts between competing class interests, or
Yeah, I mean, I think the only analysis that holds true for like all of class society is just like, why is this happening? Well, it's a transfer of wealth from the producing classes to the non-producing classes. That's why, at varying degrees and varying degrees of necessity, right? It's like, that's why it's happening. Case closed, no more analysis needed. You know what? Also, like a lot of that just kind of gets me thinking too about like, in a really kind of worrying way, like, to what extent do we just kind of like normalize the kind of post-war compact, you know what I mean, and act like that's capitalism and that's how it should function,
Yeah.
Because it's
like, possible return to that functioning. That's the social democratic dream, isn't it? That's
and that capitalism was like that maybe at some other point before that. It's like maybe what we're getting into of just like of just like violence, pure violence, and like that's the norm if you want to normalize anything. Like
I feel like the one of these pieces that I gained the most from might actually be one that you didn't read. It's written by some French communists called The Great Détournement, I think.
Oh yeah, okay.
Anyway, maybe I misunderstood that, and I'm not going to go into it too much because one, because potentially you haven't read it, and two, because it's quite a technical rundown of the political strategy that potentially lies behind the sort of Trump administration's tariff policy, I suppose. But it is also referenced a little bit in the end of the Schwong essay, so I sort of think it's interesting to point out. This is sort of coming back to what I was saying about like an effort at a realignment of how the global economy functions and works. And in that piece, they're kind of implying that the sort of like post Volcker shock world that we've been living in is one where we've moved into a global system where the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and that provides the US certain advantages and certain disadvantages, and the Trump regime is choosing to focus on the disadvantages of that. And one of the things they want to try and achieve potentially is like a devaluation of the dollar in relation to other currencies, because that seemingly has certain negative effects, I guess. I say that only because like I don't know, for me it was interesting to try and like envisage what the intended strategy is here. It is also talked about at the end of the Schwong piece, where they're like the maybe we should talk a little bit about the overall Schwong thesis, which is, as you say, like there seems to be like a an inertia to how the global economic order functions, or how the sort of like trade regime of the world functions. Partly maybe it's just because so much has been invested in so many places, and like the I think one of the things they highlight is that the profit margins in so many of these trading relationships are so thin and so small rather. It's sort of essential that they carry on. The reproduction of capital is so heavily defined by certain like movements of certain goods around the world, and they have to find valorization. And to disrupt it too heavily would just be like entirely catastrophic. But so there's my understanding of their thesis at the end was just sort of like, well, it's far harder to fundamentally change the structure of the global trade regime than what is being dreamed of by the sort of policymakers in the Trump regime. But yeah, they make the interesting point that like nobody in the world wants to have their currency become the global reserve currency. They describe it as like they describe how that sort of functions by saying that what that allows is, if you're encouraging people to hold dollars, if you're essentially like propping up the world economy in points of crisis by flooding it with dollars potentially, what you do is necessarily allow your market to be open to anybody who has dollars to buy into your market, to buy factories, to buy plant, whatever, like which like locks you into having to have a very open economic regime. Nobody else wants that, for one, is what they've said, and also what Schwang imply, and also nothing predicts that the global economy in any way is moving away from holding the dollar as its sort of like reserve currency. So it's interesting that Schwang really highlight the limitations of any effort to kind of move away from sort of status quo of the global trade, global economic policy that sort of like predominated. And I suppose potentially that highlights a question of like, does that make capitalism, does that compound capitalism's inability to deal with its crises? Like, has it grown so much? Has it sort of like, I can't find the right word, like ossified, or sort of like collected a degree of inertia where it's just like, it's beyond being able to make big corrective moves which like allow it to, I don't know, find new growth or new success or anything. I don't know.
Yeah, to grow, definitely. I think you're absolutely right. And I think like the interesting thing is we kind of saw the beginnings of the failure of the kind of like technocratic tinkering with things, which is like the kind of like globalized free trade dream where everybody enriches themselves and countries can develop themselves, which obviously started to stop with the kind of like, as you say, like with the Volcker shock and everything. And then with the 2008 crisis, like you really started to see how Democrats were kind of struggling to respond to that in an international level in the United States. But then what Schwang is saying is like, yeah, you're absolutely right, where it's like, well, even that technocratic tinkering like that, like obviously that seems like it's not really able to save capitalism from its own crises. But even these big shocks that Trump's trying to do is kind of just exacerbating things. But it's also like they're also kind of saying it's not even really exacerbate. I mean, it is exacerbating things, don't get me wrong, but it's like this administration trying to do this big shock and like tariff regime thing. It's like they say that in all likelihood, what's going to happen in Trump 2 is going to be the same thing that happened in Trump 1, which is just like modest gains for the American ruling class and some more or less minor, depending on which country he's dealing with, potentially quite major, but more or less minor, like in the global scheme of things, like trade relationships between nations. And like they, in that article on China, they give a really good example of this where they're like, China, in response to a lot of these tariffs at one point, just put huge tariffs of their own on imports of American soybeans, which like potentially would be quite a disaster for a lot of American farmers, and potentially was. But really what wound up happening was they were like, okay, fuck it, we're going to buy all of our soybeans from Brazil or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, then all of the American soybeans just went to other markets. And then Brazil was kind of selling all of these soybeans to China. And then everybody just kind of realized at a certain point, like, it's actually just be better to just go back to the way things were. And then things just kind of went back to the way things were, and the tariffs were renegotiated. It's just like all of the chaos that would have caused for like individual people's lives. It's like, really, it's just back to square one. And it's like, you know, you have no doubt that China would like to domesticate its economy much more and stop its reliance on exports. You have no doubt that America would like to stop importing so much shit from China, but it's not easy for like even the little technocrats or the, you know, for some reason, whenever I imagine like a Democrat technocrat, Milhouse just pops into my head, or like, or, you know, or the big shock and awe conservative, like authoritarians, right? So it's not very easy to do.
Yeah. Like, there's what was interesting about that case. What I understood them to be saying was that like there's also a degree to which you just cope with it, kind of thing. Like, okay, you buy from somewhere else, like, you know, for like America's still got to export its soybeans, so it's just going to export them somewhere else and probably cheaper than what they're selling them to China. And China's just going to buy them from somewhere else because they've got to import soybeans, and also these commodities have got to move around the world. And at a certain point, when you can't get them from other places, you stomach it and you buy them with the tariff attached, and your consumers just pay more. You know, it's like the what I'm surmising is that the movement of goods just can't be fundamentally can't be changed that fundamentally. You know, like who has a big enough like pork producing sector to want to buy that amount of soybean? You know. Like, yes.
Yeah, well, it's a global economy too, and like this just says nothing of the obvious point, which is just like a lot of companies and corporations don't really consider their allegiances other than their taxes to like one specific country. Like commodities traders, especially, they would probably want as little. Well, I say they would want as little like, you know, chaos in the global supply chain as possible. A lot of suppliers, commodity traders, made a lot of money off of the war in Ukraine and a lot of chaos. So, you know, speculation, I guess, always plays part of it. But like, yeah, these people just want to sell shit. It's like, I don't know. I said this in one of the recent episodes where it's just like the tools that the ruling class, the political ruling classes have at their disposal to like tinker with these things are like so limited. And it's interesting because like in the editorial, they're kind of saying that was kind of to the benefit of the Trump administration because all they wanted to do was something really like blunt. They didn't really want to think about it too much. They just wanted to very quickly renegotiate all these trade deals. So they just slapped a bunch of tariffs on things. But on the other hand, it's like, you know, just think of all the chaos and death and misery that was caused with the Volcker shock, right? It's like, we have one thing we can do that, right? Okay, that failed. Do the opposite of that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I did also laugh in that one when they said this was the 15th 5-year plan that China has. I was like, one more, one more, and we'll get there.
And then they talked about the last 5-year plan, which was from 2016 to 2020. So they're doing your 5-year plan has to be completed before the end of 5 years, otherwise.
Yeah. Otherwise, you look foolish.
Yeah, someone's going to a gulag. Yeah, I mean, there were a few interesting points raised by some of these just factual things that I really wasn't aware of. One of them, and that both to some extent relate to like sort of domestic political situations, I guess. One of them points out that imagining that tariffs are inflationary is a bit of a misnomer because they don't function like inflation. Like inflation is like a gradual increase in the price of a good. And it's quite hard to roll those back. You know, it's quite hard to bring prices down. It's quite hard to use some kind of technocratic political apparatus to like rein back inflation once it's like happening. In this, they compare a tariff to something a bit more like a fuel tax or something, like a government imposed tax, which suddenly increases the price of something overnight, but then you could just remove it again and the price would potentially go back down. Like the government like maintains some degree of control. And I think that's important to point out just because it does seem like a misnomer that is perpetuated by some people when they talk about sort of like the effect of tariffs, and that has a knock-on effect of how we imagine what their political impact is. Like if it was that they were truly inflationary, they'd have a more damaging political impact because they would be like actually impossible, not impossible, but like more technically difficult for the Trump. I don't want to say regime again. I've said regime so many times. What do they normally talk about?
I don't know.
Anyway, the Trump government.
Yeah.
They have the ability to fix this in a way that on the left we might, if we were politically opposed to Trump and the Republicans, which we are, but like you might want to imagine, well, this is somehow politically advantageous. It's going to backfire on them. It's necessarily going to backfire on them. But it really, one, tariffs are targeted at particular goods, as you're saying, and don't hit the whole economy. And two, they are like malleable in a way which other inflationary forces aren't necessarily, kind of thing. So.
That's a really good point. I don't know if I either
that
my
might
eyes glazed over at that point,
read, or like a lot of
You're
skimming.
right.
Maybe my brain sort of clicked into place. In that, moment.
Right when mine clicked out of place. You're right. You're right. But I mean, it's also worth pointing out, like specific commodities. Obviously, like any change will just have massive. Like I'm just talking about fossil fuels and like specifically just oil, right? If there's any change in the price of oil, it's like, oh, okay, now inflation is really going to start because everything needs oil.
I suppose, yeah, there are some commodities which affect supply chains in a particular way.
Which of course, yeah. Speaking of countries,
well, that's in some way, like, okay, yeah.
I'm just guessing.
But I mean, like the short, I guess the fossil fuel shortage that's affected inflation across the world, but particularly in Europe, as a result of the Ukraine wars, like it's still an artificial choice to withhold fossil fuel supply, kind of thing. Like,
true.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, you're right.
But you make a good point. I think that I hadn't really thought about. So.
Or for Russia to bomb their own pipeline, which I'm still trying to understand why they did that one to create all this artificial scarcity. Somebody should have told them that wasn't very smart. Speaking of places that like to mine and pump fossil fuels, did you read the Australia one? The Australian one was very good.
I did. Yeah.
It was very good. There were a few, I think, points maybe we just briefly touch on. This one and the Mexico one, actually, I think the Mexico one might have been the standout one for me. But this one was very, very good because it gave you, just like the Mexico one, it gave you an understanding of how all of these things are affecting different countries differently. And Australia is in such a weird place economically and such a weird place geopolitically and geographically that like this new Trump administration really has a unique effect, it would seem, on the Australian economy. Doesn't seem to have done much for Australian politics, which is interesting. One of the main points in this is that the center is kind of held there. The Labour Party, they've done very well in recent elections, and they have a Labour prime minister. But just seeing the way that that is to say, a centrist government, right? Like seeing the way that they have responded to these has been very interesting. And just to say, like, the authors of that piece say that Australia is unique for a number of different reasons, but the main one is that its main trading partner is just China, right? It's just its natural trading partner since it's kind of moved on from Japan in that regard. But its like geopolitical ally is the United States, and with the really excellently named AUKUS agreement, where Australia was going to buy all of these nuclear submarines, which may or may not happen now. You see this kind of like 1 foot in one sphere, 1 foot in the other sphere, where economically, like the Australian ruling class, political class doesn't want to do anything to upset like their trade deals with China, although they do rhetorically now and then talk about, red China, bad red China, but then while also like being military allies of the United States, right? Like it's very strange to see how they'll react to this. And the main through line for a lot of these countries, at least in kind of like the imperial core, like the global north or whatever you want to call it, the wealthier kind of like imperial countries, is that they are also kind of trying to do some type of reshoring. But in their case, because they have all of these precious minerals, they're just kind of trying to store up a bunch of them and kind of just hopefully ride this thing out. It was a really interesting piece.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think their exposure to the tariffs seem quite like structurally determined by, just the things that they're exporting and the things that tariffs are being placed on. Australia in an interesting position just because like that relationship to China has almost prevented it from having suffered any, like it didn't have a recession. It was one of the only countries to not have a recession in 2008 because of the trading relationship with China, which in some ways adds to its answers some of the questions around its political stability, I suppose, or the success of the sort of centrism and the centre holding and Labour Party winning re-election. In some ways stems from like its ability to maintain sort of a functioning capitalist economy a bit longer than other places might be achieving, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. It's all interesting. I mean, maybe I don't know how much more there really is on that one, other than just that, a reminder that politics are specific to where your political theater is. That's like an obvious thing to say, but like, this attempted restructuring of the global supply chains and global economy, like, obviously affects different places differently, in some cases very differently. And Australia seems to be doing all right, at least for the moment, depending on, how much defense spending or something like that America wants to like wring out of it. Did you read the Mexico one?
I did, yeah. Okay. I was sort of like rushing it toward the end, but it was the one that impacted me the most, I think. Cool. At least in terms of like, contributing to my heightened degree of despair at the state of the world kind of thing. Yeah. And that's also the one that it's in some ways it strays away from tariffs a little bit, but it includes tariffs, or the utilization of tariffs by the United States, by the sort of like core of the world economy, sort of incorporates that into a broader set of strategies, which sort of like for them sort of define the nature of this sort of like global order that we live in. As you were saying before, this is the one that's most heavily impacted by like left communist thinking, but in a way which was like sort of like well utilized in a way, and I enjoyed it. But but like it's the one that's like, you mentioned violence before in some context, and I was just like, this is the piece that really sort of like portrays the true violence of the. Oh, you were talking about the. I think maybe you were talking about like the atypical nature of the sort of like post World War II Bretton Woods regime that we sometimes think of as being like the true functioning incarnation of capitalism. Well, actually, like maybe it's the border between the United States and Mexico and the regime in Mexico, and the sort of utilitarian approach taken by capitalism toward the sort of global reserve army of labor, which sees it as totally disposable to the point of exposing it to state and non-state violence in a way which is like completely just has no respect for human life at a certain basic point. I mean, maybe that's the true nature of capitalism, isn't it? It's just to like extract the productive capacity from human beings and then sort of like throw them away. That's the general feeling that I came away from having read it anyway.
Yeah. This was also the one that I think syntactically was the most of the ultra left sphere, I think, which I dig, but it is always funny. It's always like before you even get the endnotes or the theory communist like references, it's like,
you're like, oh yeah,
this is going.
I recognize this.
I know where this is going. I mean, yeah, that piece was really, really excellent. It starts with this idea, right, of the double frontier of Mexico, and about how Mexico is again like another one of these unique places where the effects of this restructuring are going to be felt uniquely, right? Where there's this physical frontier where it's the frontier of like migration, obviously, coming from Central and South America towards kind of the United States. It's also like an ecological frontier for a number of different reasons, but one of the main ones being specifically like southern Mexico is one of the places most primed to see like a real disaster scenario play out with climate change and the kind of the collapse of biodiversity and different things like that. And then there's also like the double nature of the frontier. There's also like, they call this like immaterial frontier, right? Where it's the frontier of capital, where it's the place where the kind of like massive and ever-growing global reserve army of labor meets kind of like productive capital, but then also just like the global north, right? Which makes it a frontier because, well, I guess I would make it more of like a physical frontier, but like, yeah, it's where I guess a lot of these social relations kind of begin to dissolve. And this is kind of, I think, like one of the really interesting things about this piece is that it makes the point that like for capital at the moment, there's this idea of like negative valorization, which is an idea that I've heard and or I've read in like a number of different ultra left things, and I don't think I've ever really fully understood. But it's this really interesting idea where like, you know, instead of capital doing what you think capital should do, which is just constantly accumulate never growing amounts, what it's actually doing now is shutting down the possibilities for not just growth in capital accumulation, but also its foundation in terms of like the proletariat, right? It's like destroying in certain places like Mexico the conditions for people to even become proles, which is a really interesting idea. And it's negative valorization, right? It's the idea of like, you know, a deliberate abandonment of large sections of the proletariat to just their own devices. And, you know, you brought up like state and non-state violence. The state violence we read about in like that migration piece where it's like turning places like Jordan and Syria into just like certain parts of it, at least like very large scale. I mean, internment camps, I suppose, is one way to put it, obviously, for migrants, people who would like to migrate, obviously. And then the non-state violence, you think of things like, you know, kind of narco-terrorism or narco-trafficking. And they make the really interesting point that like in those conditions where the state is, and not just the state, like capital has really given up the responsibility that it has and the necessity that it has for social reproduction of the proletariat, right? Like when it gives that up, social reproduction is often that responsibility is taken up by kind of like non-state actors in a really vicious and terrible way. I mean, I'm ending on what I'm saying on a sad note too.
Yeah, I've never come across the idea of negative valorization before, and I don't remember seeing that terminology in this piece. But as I say, I was like, you know, I was skimming a little bit. Reading. I do. One of the things that really struck me was one of the early sort of theoretical assertions is this idea of the decoupling of the valorization of capital from the reproduction of labor, which is the same thing you're implying, right? Like, well, not quite the same thing, because like in that instance, it's like in a sort of like nice model of sort of like textbook model of capitalism from a Marxist perspective, you have like the desire by capitalists to valorize and reproduce labor and extract from that process a profit. But also in that process, the worker gets a portion of the value produced by their labor, enough to sufficiently reproduce their existence. And there is this sort of like mutual reliance on the process to some extent, or capitalism has an interest at least in reproducing the labor supply to some extent. But like they're asserting that there's been this decoupling of the two, which I don't understand necessarily how that functions on an economic level, but like on a human level, from the standpoint of analyzing some of the material that we talked about last week in the global development essay, like making the lack of global development and some of the negative consequences that have come out of that, i.e. the sort of massive flows of migrants across certain borders, across certain portions of the world. That's an interesting way of framing that relationship between the global core and the periphery, and how capitalism functions in the core is related to the periphery, but also like it's an interesting way of like separating like the valorization and the reproduction of value in the global core, like a core which has like outsourced production to the periphery, a sort of like dissociated itself from the relationship of employing people and ensuring the reproduction of those workers. And there's no requirement to ensure the reproduction of those workers because there's just plenty more where they came from, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Hence what we talked about last week of the idea, or last time, of the idea of like global migrant populations functioning as a global reserve army of labor for capitalism, which it can sort of like take from when it needs, but ignore when it doesn't need it, which comes back to what you were just saying about then you get these situations where portions of the world are housing these people in migrant camps or forcing them to reproduce their existence through like the criminal enterprise or terrorist groups or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Which we talked about when we talked about like Boko Haram and all those different groups, right? Al-Shabaab, It's a similar thing, right? When social reproduction gets taken up by them. It's an interesting point you make too, because it's like, it relates to ecology in a way that they bring up in here, but then it also relates to it in a way where it's like, there's a tendency, I think, and I've done this a lot, and I'm kind of thinking this through while I'm saying it, so it might not make any sense, but there's a tendency when you're talking about the relationship between capitalism and ecology to just be like, capitalism appropriates its ecology, doesn't care about it like reproducing it. It just wants to take, have this fossil economy that it's the idea that like maybe capitalism couldn't have gotten up off the ground if it couldn't massively appropriate huge sources of energy that are impossible to replace, and capital doesn't really care about that. But I think it's probably a bit more nuanced than that, and in a way that kind of mirrors what you're talking about the relationship between capital, where I suppose maybe like individual capitalists and political actors acting on behalf of capital, like to the proletariat, where it's like, to what extent is this like just an uptick in the way that capital has always treated the reserve army of labor? Is it actually like a quantity into quality change? Like maybe what's being argued here is that it is kind of a quantity into quality thing, where it's like, it's not so much that it's always appropriated this labor to exploit it, right? Like maybe it's a question of that, I don't know, that relationship is constantly changing is what I'm trying to say. I think you'd be hard pressed to say that there haven't been capitalist regimes that aren't like environmentalists, definitely not ecologists, but like environmentalists. Like Nixon called himself an environmentalist. I think he was probably right about that, unfortunately, right? Like there's a relationship between capitalism and its so-called like externalities, including this labor pool of people that aren't laboring, like where I think it's constantly changing. And maybe if there is a qualitative change that's happened in that regard with both its relationship to its ecology and this like labor pool, maybe that change is like that now it's actively seeking its destruction. You know what I mean? Now it's actively like just trying to just see it fucking gone and just have it be a problem it doesn't have to deal with, because like there's certainly a death drive in the way that capitalism is relating to the biosphere in terms of like, you see a lot of people be like, maybe you shouldn't be too much of a climate apocalyptic person, which you shouldn't be. But then also it's like, what about the current state of things has led us to think that there isn't going to like Trump administration, liberal administrations everywhere are still just pumping fucking oil out of the ground, right? Pumping natural gas and all of this shit. Like there's a death drive there. And unfortunately, like, this is a very grim thing to say, but like we've seen in Palestine, we see just that whole part of the world, right? With like Jordan and Syria and different places like this. And with the way that migrants from Latin America are treated, it's like maybe there is like actually now just a like qualitative change in that now it's not seeking to keep these little spheres of appropriation, little marble gardens or whatever that it can appropriate whenever it wants, exploit, I guess I should say, whenever it wants. Now it's like these are actively like a hindrance to capital. It's a very grim thought. I don't know if any of that made sense. I was kind of just thinking about it as I said it.
No, I really appreciated it. And it's nice, not nice. It's valuable for me to have it phrased in the idea of a drive, right? Because that was the thing that I was coming away from reading most of these pieces with, but I think particularly that one written from the perspective of Mexico, which is that like more than ever before, I think that's brought home to me how above all else capitalism is just this relentless drive for ever expanding profits, the valorization of capital to the exclusion of everything else, to the point of a total destruction, I guess. I guess I knew that already, but like the real I don't know. Yeah, the real relentless, murderous nature of that. Yeah, I hadn't. I don't know. Sometimes you're just struck by it. And I was struck by it.
Yeah, no kidding. And to put it in that, there's one sentence in there where they say the result is a tragic paradox, an economy that no longer needs workers and a society that can't survive without them. It's like, oh my God. But it's also like the paradox is even deeper than that because the economy also needs workers to valorize itself. So it's like,
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's just further compounding the falling rate of profit that comes about by the automation of labor, which is also a necessity for the continued functioning of capitalism, but also undermines it. So. Yes, automation, like not if anybody, I mean, I've never read any Anton Benenev, but like the real sort of like targeted attack that essay makes against anybody thinking that automation in and itself is good, or like there is some technical thing that capitalism is bringing about that's going to save us from this. It's just like, capitalism is evolving technologically, but purely for the function of extracting value from workers and, otherwise leaving us to die, kind of thing.
Yeah. It would be really cool if machines could make value. I feel like that would just kind of solve everything.
Well, yeah.
What are you going to do? I mean, you're right. And they also make the point in that piece where it's like, obviously, when you look at it from this angle, like deindustrialization or, so-called premature deindustrialization, especially in places like Mexico, like that doesn't free up anybody's time. That's kind of the whole point of capitalism. It just creates more opportunities for more valorization, right? It's like, yeah. Really quick, there were two more that I read, at least. There was one written by an Italian guy. I think he's Italian, Raphael. I think it's either Scortino or Scortino. And the thing that I took from that one was basically just like a quick analysis that he did of what Trump's second term has meant, specifically in the wake of the failure of the Biden administration, even though the Biden administration just kind of kept doing a lot of what Trump was doing. Don't want to be flippant about it, but like, and he gives three reasons for why this will that failure will materially affect this second Trump term. Three failures, I guess I should say. He says, one, there was a failure of the Biden administration and just like the massive American security apparatus to secure a so-called like strategic defeat of Russia and Ukraine. And that's just led to like a further breach in relationships with Russia. And then obviously with China, because there's been rapprochement between Russia and China. There was a failure to kind of decouple from China on both ends. China was trying to just continues to be trying to make that decoupling happen. Certainly not happening. And then just like the failure to keep civil society like operating, and just completely fucking deteriorating. So Trump's answer to that was just, all that money that these administrations have been giving to the Department of Homeland Security, fucking quintuple it. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that is a nice way of like, well, in some ways I'm like, there were some pretty difficult things to try and solve.
Yes, right? They were very big. They were very big goals. I mean, decouple from China.
I almost feel like solving Ukraine and Russia is the easiest one of those things.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But on another level, like that's another step toward like giving some material basis for a sort of material context for understanding what Trump or the Trump administration, that was the word I was looking for before, administration, what the Trump administration is attempting to do. So it gives some rationale to that, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think if we want to be charitable, and I'm just thinking about this, it's probably like come up with a solution for these problems. Don't necessarily do them, but come up with a regime and a plan that would make these things happen. Yeah. In which case, Trump's going to fail too. So.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. It's like these faults, whatever it is. I mean, it does come back to what I was saying before. Is, I guess, question A is Trump actually like trying to solve material problems, material crises of the global economy? And I think probably yes. And two, like, Like, I guess, was Bidenism offering any alternatives for that, or was it a sort of like continuation of the status quo? And it's quite easy to criticize it as being a continuation of the status quo, but I think that was probably true, right? Like, Bidenism, or the sort of mainstream of Democrats in the US still, and Stalmerite centrism as well. It's clinging to a world order, to a form of capitalism that perhaps is just evidently becoming untenable. So that maybe that's how you sum up that critique of Biden and the Biden administration, is just for cleaving entirely to the mainstream of the past, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's interesting too, because it's like, the Build Back Better stuff, at least at first, like, it was pretty audacious. Like, not in like a Marxist sense, but it was audacious for the circumstances, Yeah. But again, I mean, we got to criticize both administrations on the same terms. It's like limited options here. It's like, Biden, 4 years, reverse the decline of American civil society. How are you going to do it when literally no member of the ruling political class is going to help you? But yeah, I don't know. Yeah. And then the last bit in that essay, which kind of ties into the last essay, at least that I read, the one by Jamie Merchant, is basically just like the Democrats represent this kind of like end of that kind of like quote unquote happy globalized moment of free trade, maybe that like post-war compact era, Bretton Woods kind of stuff, right? Like, yeah, trade now has very clearly just become like a matter of national security, which is like a completely different way of framing it, right? As it was as recently as Biden's administration, although Biden, I guess, did like, make signs in this direction as well. Maybe I should say like Obama or somebody like that. Like, for those people, for the technocrats, it was like, enrich yourselves. And, a Marxist understanding of that would be like they're enriching themselves off the backs of like, the labor of the proletariat. But like, now it is just full, like, we are using this to politically and militarily ensure that America remains the kind of like imperial hegemon in the face of like a decline on all fronts.
And that, I mean, that's the aspect that relates most closely to more recent, like, notable Trump policies in relation to the world. Like the hostility toward the NATO alliance, or the invasion and kidnap in Venezuela, could be decried as being like woe is me, what's become of the rules-based global order, sort of what's become of the countries respecting the sovereignty of others, as is written into like the norms of what's represented by the United Nations and stuff. But that's another aspect of like the world that Trump is breaking from quite violently, whether that's possible, whether it's wise, whether it's achievable. But we should definitely recognize that, like, that is what's happening, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. It's so hard, like, at the same time too, though, it's so hard to like picture, because another point that's made in this last piece by Jamie Merchant is like, if we saw like a relative decrease in like like a decrease in interstate outright wars, right, in the period that we're talking about, like after World War II and now, like, that was because everybody was just busy enriching themselves internationally, all the capitalists, I mean. But now that piece of the pie is like, not growing anymore, and there's no hope for it to grow anymore. You're seeing struggles between different members of the ruling class, and between the ruling class and, the proletariat, right? Like, in a way that supposedly might hint at wars to come, which certainly is like, seemingly what the Trump administration would want, like a war with China or something like that. But at the same time, it's like, how could that happen? It's like they couldn't even figure out a way to stop trading soybeans with each other. You know what I mean? It's like, on one hand, it needs to happen, but on the other hand, like, it just can't happen. Like, nobody could have that happen. Like, yeah, I guess those are the conditions for in theory, just like a long, slow, fucking grinding decline. But then at the same time, it's like, but a big collapse needs to happen too. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know whether there was definitely one of these pieces that implied that the ultimate aim of the Trump administration in relation to this tariff regime is actually to secure its own version of a global peace. Like, I don't know whether war with China or war with Iran or, I don't know, war with Russia is what Trump actually wants. I think it's like I don't know, maybe it is the kind of multipolar world that they're aiming for. They just want Europe to protect itself so that the United States doesn't have to put all this money into the sort of defense umbrella of the NATO system. But like, they definitely don't have any interest in fighting a war with Russia, for God's sake.
Yeah.
It's like,
but I mean, and it's also like everything is just so seemingly simulated now. I mean, we're not going to know about the realities of a lot of these different like conflicts and stuff for a long time, but it's like Maduro, it did seem like he was kind of ready to give himself up at a certain point, if not just resign. Probably not give himself up, probably resign, maybe. The Trump administration was like, no. So it's like, was this just an agreed upon spectacle? Probably not, but maybe. And then it's like, whenever Iran and Israel launch missiles at each other, but no one's really trying to do anything too crazy because they know they can't. Well, if it's very simulated, all I'm saying, nobody told the Trump administration that like a rapid devaluation and destruction of fixed capital might actually help out the global accumulation regime. Nobody told them that.
Yeah, hopefully nobody in the Trump administration is reading Marx.
Yeah, I get the feeling that is not the case.
Okay, good. I mean, Steve Bannon was the closest person that might give it a chance.
God, yeah.
Keep him out of there.
Well,
here we are.
Here we are. A return to social democracy, Dan, might be needed for our own sanity. We'll see.
No, there was a lot in these pieces that I really appreciated.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I've enjoyed doing this one this week.
Yep,
as ever.
It's been very, very good. Everybody should just go read these. We'll put a link or something in the bottom. But yeah, it's very good. I'm gonna go finish my baked beans, Dan. Thank you very much.
I think I'm just gonna go to bed.
See ya.
Good night, everyone.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out and much, 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 much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.